This is going to be a spoiler-laden conversation about the Scream Trilogy. This trilogy is a really peculiar beast. Scream both single-handedly revitalised and revolutionised the horror genre when it was released back in 1996 and has since spawned 3 sequels. Now, for the purpose of this video and review, I'm going to talk about the first 3 movies of the franchise, and that is of course starting with Scream. Now, this is directed by Wes Craven, the man responsible for films like The Hills Have Eyes, The Last House on the Left, A Nightmare on Elm Street, New Nightmare, just a string of fantastic horror movies. And this was really his comment on those horror movies. It's written by Kevin Williamson, who really kind of made a name for himself writing films like this. He also went on to write I Know What You Did Last Summer and start that franchise off. So there was a lot of talent behind this movie. Now, as I said, it was released back in '96, and this was at a point in Hollywood where the horror genre was really kind of wilting. Everybody had grown weary of slasher films, and there was nothing fresh happening. And ironically enough, the most fresh kind of horror slasher film that came out was a couple of years prior, and that was Wes Craven's New Nightmare, the last in the Freddy Krueger series. And in that film, he really tackled the themes of metafiction and how life imitates art, imitates life. And that's a theme that he really extended into Scream with the help of Kevin Williamson. Right off the bat, you know that Scream is not going to be your dad's slasher film. It begins with a terrific scene starring Drew Barrymore. Now, you have to remember that during the marketing for Scream, she was billed as one of the top actresses. Her name was above the title, and still is actually. Her name's on the front cover of the DVD. It starts with a scene where she's stalked around her house for a scene that lasts about 15 minutes and is then brutally murdered. Now, think back, '96, Drew Barrymore was a rising star. She was probably the equivalent of today's Anna Paquin, somebody like that, a very recognisable face who was about to break into the big time. And as I said, she was billed as one of the main actresses, so when she was killed in the first 15 minutes, it was a shock. I can remember the first time I watched this movie when I was a lot younger, when it was released on VHS. And I was shocked because I recognised Drew Barrymore and I knew her from a couple of films. I knew that she was the little girl from Close Encounters. And to see her get brutally murdered at the beginning of the film, I was flabbergasted, and I still am when I watch the film now. It's so brave of Wes Craven and Kevin Williamson to do that. And to be honest, that scene is the reason that Scream is such a unique and brilliant film. And it's also the reason that the franchise never quite lived up to its potential. In terms of potential, they've killed one of the main characters and main actresses at the beginning of the first film. They've only ever tackled that kind of scene once more in one of the sequels. I'll get onto that in a moment. But the way in which they did it, as I said, the scene lasts 15 minutes. And is one of the tensest, most horrific and mean-spirited stalk and slash scenes I think I've ever seen. They are basically about a serial killer who is influenced by horror movies, killing off a bunch of teens. So it's got the setup of your typical slasher film, but the postmodern twist that all the characters are in on the joke and they all are well aware of horror movies and the rules of horror movies. So what I found is, as the films go on and you get more of them, and as you get to Scream 4, there's no real weight to the stalk and slash scenes, or kind of very little. There is occasionally, there are a few brilliant scenes in all the movies, but it gets less and less as the series progresses. This first scene with Drew Barrymore, people forget. It's mean-spirited, it's hard to watch. There's a moment where Drew Barrymore is so close to being rescued by her parents, and she's crying out for help and they just can't hear her, and then she's butchered. It's scenes like this that really make Scream stand out from the horror genre. Rather than have a boogeyman, Scream actually has 2 killers. This is another cliche that Wes Craven and Kevin Williamson have flipped over on its head, and one that I really appreciate. We then get Scream 2. Now, this is a film that could have very easily messed up the whole franchise, but luckily they did a good job, and it is almost as good, well, if not as good as the first film. So this is Scream 2. Now, what I really like about this is that in order to do a sequel, Wes Craven and Kevin Williamson have addressed the fact that it's a sequel. In the movie, all the characters refer to this new killing spree as a real-life sequel, and there are new horror rules to come up with. This is what I really like about this movie. It's meta in that the events of the first film are being portrayed in a fictional film inside the film, a film within a film, if you will, called Stab. And that's just the right amount of meta for me, and the characters comment on the rules of that film, blah, 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 and it really helps set up the structure of the real-life sequel. Now, what I really admire Scream 2 for is that it has some of the greatest set pieces that were around at the time. The main one is the character of Randy, played by Jamie Kennedy, being killed in the middle of the film in broad daylight in a most horrific fashion. This is akin to the Drew Barrymore sequence from the first film. And not only is he killed, there is a moment after it where Neve Campbell and David Arquette discuss having to tell his parents what had happened. And it's just this little heartbreaking moment that somebody's being killed. They mourn this person, and that's really the last moment in any of the Scream films that you feel the weight of what's been happening. The other set piece that springs to mind is a scene where Sydney, played by Neve Campbell, and her friend are trapped in a police car that's assaulted by Ghostface. The two bodyguards or policemen are killed, and Ghostface drives the car, crashes it, and they have to try and get out of the car. That is a brilliant set piece. The tension is so well built and constructed. Wes Craven really takes his time the same way that he did with the Drew Barrymore sequence in setting up this sequence, and it's all the more frightening for it. After all, Scream is a horror movie. Yes, it's almost a parody of itself in its own genre, but it is still a horror movie, and the first two films do have frightening moments. That brings us on to where it all goes wrong, Scream 3. Now, just to say, I do not hate this film. I actually quite like it, but comparing it to Scream 1 and 2, it just doesn't hold up. Now, I can see why Kevin Williamson jumped ship, and ironically enough, he was overtaken by a writer called Aaron Kruger. Not a bad writer, I believe he wrote the remake of The Ring. I quite like Aaron Kruger's writing, but when you compare it to what's come before, it just doesn't hold up. Now, Scream 3 is the moment where it all gets too meta. The fictional Stab films that are featured in Scream 2, I think it's now up to like Stab 3 in this movie. And it's, rather than set in Woodsboro, it's set in Hollywood. The characters played by Courtney Cox, David Arquette, Neve Campbell have their counterparts being played by them in the Stab movies. And it all just gets lost in its own mythology. Another problem I have with Scream 3 is the fact that it has so much misplaced humour in it. I mean, there's a moment where Jay and Silent Bob pop up, Kevin Smith and Jason Mewes, two guys that I love. I love those characters, I love those movies, but they have no place in a Scream movie. And you also have Carrie Fisher, although she's not really Carrie Fisher. It doesn't work. For the most part, Scream 3, if the editor had taken a pair of scissors to it and cut out all the unnecessary humour and the contrived plot devices, it would be a much better film. I also don't mind the retcon at the ending when we find out who the killer is, and they tie that into Sydney's mother from before the first film and how he influenced the original killers, Billy Loomis and Stu. I don't mind that. I can live with that. I think in the overall mythology of the series, it kind of fits. But I just feel like it was presented not particularly well. It was a little convoluted. And the film really kind of let down the franchise. However, it's not terrible. I can still watch them all and enjoy them. Plus, as we all know, Wes Craven and Kevin Williamson have reunited recently and just made Scream 4, which is a vast improvement on this one. Yes, it doesn't reach the heights of the first two, but it is still a good movie, and if you want to know more about that, I'll link you to my review of Scream 4 on my own channel below. But for the most part, Scream 3 is an enjoyable film, and it does have its frightening moments. The Scream Trilogy really is a peculiar beast in that it starts off reinventing and revolutionising the horror genre and almost parodying it, and then it becomes, by the time we get to Scream 3, it becomes the very thing that the first film was making fun of. It's a shame really, but as I said, they've tried to rescue it with Scream 4 and for the most part have been successful. So, my thoughts on the Scream trilogy. It's a fantastic trilogy. The first two films are brilliant. They're both as good as each other, and I highly recommend it to horror fans or fans of whodunits, because rather than knowing who the killer is from the outset like we do with Freddy Krueger and Michael Myers, these films are whodunits. If you haven't seen them, go watch them. They are fantastic. So I highly recommend the Scream trilogy. I hope you've enjoyed this review. Please subscribe to my channel if you like what you've seen, and thanks very much for watching.